Hello, everyone, and welcome to our 7th and final IQSA Zoom Quran seminar. This seminar, like all of the other sessions, is sponsored by the International Quranic Studies Association. And in this time especially, I'd really like to encourage you to join IQSA, which is a community of scholars, some with academic positions or graduate students, but others just interested students in Quranic studies. The inscription is very modest, and it's a wonderful way to join a community of people dedicated to the study of the Quran. So I'd encourage you to join. And that's also the best way to get updates about future IQSA activities, including the next round of these seminars. I'm really delighted for this, our final seminar in this round, to introduce a very esteemed scholar and a wonderful person, Professor Robert Hoyland. I would give just a brief introduction, although there are many, many works that could be cited. Professor Hoyland read Oriental Studies at Oxford University, where he subsequently wrote a doctoral thesis on non-Muslim accounts of the rise of Islam, which many of you have known and probably use, entitled Seeing Islam as Others Saw It. That was published in 1997. The emergence of Islamic civilization has remained one of his principal research interests. It is the subject of his very influential book, In God's Path, The Arab Conquest and the Creation of an Islamic Empire, which was published in 2014. Some other books have come out since then as well, including in 2018, a translation of the sections, if I'm getting this right, Robert, correct me if I get it wrong, the sections in 3 Arabic historical chronicles on pre-Islamic Persia, and that's entitled Kings of the Persians. Did I describe that basically right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. And he's, as many of you know, he's also worked extensively on pre-Islamic Arabia and published a number of articles, including on epigraphy, an influential article, The Content and Context of Early Arabic Inscriptions in 1997. Also on papyrology, the article, very influential as well, The Earliest Attestation of the Dhimma of God and His Messenger, and the rediscovery of Papyrus Nassana 77. That was a 2014 article. He's worked in Syriac as well and translated Theophilus of Edessa's chronicle, reconstructing that, I think, is the best way to put it, from a number of sources, which was a very complicated task. He's also worked in the field in archaeology, as our guest last week, Professor Jalad, has, and has been involved in excavations in Syria, Yemen, Israel, Palestine, and Turkey, Kurdistan. Today, Robert will speak with us on Arabi and A'jami in the Quran, the language of revelation, and Muhammad's Hijaz. And I'll turn things over to you, Robert. Thank you for being here.
Great. Thanks, Gabriel. Thanks all of you for turning in. I'm not very brilliantly capable on these things, but hopefully.
Perfect. Great.
Everyone can see that? Fantastic. Okay, so this talk will discuss the written language situation of the Prophet Muhammad's homeland, the Hijaz, in the central west and northwest of modern Saudi Arabia, through the lens of the Quranic terms Arabi and A'jami. I'll say in advance that marrying up Quranic statements with historical context is a problematic task. One thinks of the classic article of Patricia Crona, How Did the Quranic Pagans Make a Living?, which some loved but many hated. And so I will understand, even sympathize, if you think that such forced marriages are fruitless. But anyway, let's have a go and see where we get. So writing is a major theme in the Quran. The main verb connected with writing, kataba, occurs 58 times. And related verbs like satara and khatta feature 7 times and 1 time respectively. Furthermore, we encounter a number of terms for writing materials: parchment, kirtas, 2 times, writing implements, pen, for example, qalam, 4 times, and the products of writing, book, kitab, of course, a whopping 261 times, and folios, suhuf, 8 times. Muhammad's audience were then familiar with writing, and they were encouraged to use it for recording contracts, such as for marriage and for debts, as we see in verse 282, which it's interesting actually. If you just simply mark the words in it connected with writing, it's in bold, you can see it occurs many times. You who believe, when you contract a debt for a specified term, write it down. Let a scribe write it between you in justice. Let no scribe refuse to write as God has taught him, etc. Unfortunately for us, no documents have as yet been discovered in the Hijaz from Muhammad's lifetime or from the century before it. As even inscriptions, the last dated one is 456 AD, so that leaves plenty of scope for conspiracy theorists and many others to think, aha, so Islam wasn't actually born here, nothing happened here in the century before Muhammad. We have therefore no direct evidence outside of the Quran for what languages and scripts were utilized by Muhammad and his audience to conduct their commercial and religious affairs. But the Quran does at least offer us some clues. In particular, it employs two terms to refer to what appear to be two distinct languages, or two different forms of language, Arabi and A'jami. The former is always used in a positive sense. These are the verses of the scripture that make clear. We sent it down as an Arabi lectionary so that you might understand. When Quran is being used indefinitely, I'm going to put lectionary. The problem for us is Quran is, wow, such a big term that it's difficult for us to get back to when Muhammad's speaking what he's actually meaning. And he isn't meaning scripture for 1.3 billion people that has this fixed form that everyone knows about and you can buy it in your local shop. So I'm just going to put lectionary as, I could have put recitation with the other option. We made it an unambiguous Arabi lectionary so that they might be God-fearing. This lectionary is a book that confirms the book of Moses in the Arabi language. Just as the archetype of the scripture that is kept by God is said by the Quran to be clarifying, mubin, so also the Arabi language is clarifying, making clear the message that it conveys. We made it an Arabi lectionary, the Quran has God say, precisely so that you may understand. The term A'jami, on the other hand, is always contrasted negatively with Arabi. Verse 16:103 reports that people say that, quote, a mere man is teaching him. But the language of the one they allude to is A'jami, whereas this is an Arabi language that clarifies. The use of the Arabi tongue is said to be conducive to belief, whereas the use of A'jami has the opposite effect. If we had sent it down to one of the A'jami people, speakers, and he, Muhammad, had recited it to them in the A'jami language, they would not have believed in it. The frequent emphasis on the Arabi language of the Quran and on its clarity, and the pejorative tone towards the A'jami language suggests a polemical agenda. Presumably some in Muhammad's audience were questioning whether Arabi was an appropriate language for a divine revelation. Should not a language that had already conveyed scripture have been used, such as Greek or Aramaic? It is this viewpoint that Muhammad was attempting to refute. One of his arguments against it appears in 14:4. We never sent a messenger except that he gave his message in the language of his people. He's making the point then that God always imparted his message in the language of his target audience, presumably because it had a better chance of being clearly understood. That is why God chose, in the case of Muhammad's people, to send his revelation to them in their language, namely Arabi, so that Muhammad might warn the mother of towns and those around it, as it says in 42:7. That is, the populations in and around his place of residence. Muhammad is aware that other divine messages were communicated in other languages, such as A'jami, but they were not the language of his people, and so could not readily be apprehended by them, lessening the effectiveness of his message. So what is Arabi? What was the exact significance of the word Arabi? And why did Muhammad need to stress the fact that the Quran and its language were Arabi? Grammatically, Arabi is a nisba, an adjective expressing relationship, from the word Arab, the term for a particular people of the Middle East. However, that only raises another question. Who would have called themselves an Arab in the time of Muhammad? The term has been in use from the 9th century BC until today, but over those many centuries, it has of course meant different things to different people, in different places, at different times. Since Muslim Quran commentary only began in earnest in the first Abbasid century, so 750 to 850, it was inevitably influenced by the definition of Arab then current. The 7th century conquests of the Hijazes had placed them in control of many different peoples, many with a long and venerable history. And this prompted the new leaders to redefine their own identity, in particular to claim all of the Arabian Peninsula as their homeland, and all of its inhabitants, past and present, as belonging to the same ethnic group, the Arabs. Closely accompanying this development was the emergence of a greater role for the Arabic language. It soon became the most important vehicle for the administrative, literary, and scientific expression of the new empire, and became an object of study and classification by an eager cadre of lexicographers and grammarians. It is self-evident then that Arab and arabī could not have meant the same to Muhammad as it meant to the Quran exegetes active in the time of the Abbasid caliphs of Baghdad. This has recently been highlighted by a number of scholars, in particular Peter Webb, who, though they have different agendas, all make the valid point that one should avoid associating Quranic arabī, or the term from which it is derived, Arab, with the grander and wider signification that the Abbasids attach to it, and with the even broader encompass that it has acquired in modern times. But what did Arabi and Arab mean to Muhammad? Particularly relevant to this question is the annexation by the Roman Empire in 105 to 6 CE of the Nabatean Kingdom, which ruled over most of modern Jordan and northwest Saudi Arabia. This annexation and the concomitant creation of the Roman province of Arabia initiated two developments in the former Nabatean lands that had far-reaching consequences. Firstly, the term Arab, which had been employed by Greco-Roman authors in a rather loose way to designate any and all residents of Arabia, became increasingly applied to settled residents. Just a minute, sorry, I missed giving you a screen, didn't I? Missed you a slide out. Okay, so this is for this one. As the term Arab became applied to settled residents of the new province of Arabia. This change was in part driven by the declaration of universal citizenship by Emperor Caracalla in 212 CE, which meant that even those who lived in the remote Hijaz could legitimately call themselves imperial citizens in what was officially known as the province of the Arabs, Provincia Araborum in Latin, and Ard al-Arab in Arabic. Plausibly, obviously we have no attestation, but it occurs in early examples in the 7th century. So I give you some examples on the slide of this phenomenon where people start putting the Arab after their name in the 3rd to 6th centuries. Rufinus the Arab is quite an early one. He's from Qanawat in Syria, which would have been in the province of Arabia. John the Arab is a late one from 6th century in Jericho. And the same, the two soldiers from Pella, the ethnos of the Arabs, are from the 6th century too. So the second development, so first, this term Arab gets a more, if you like, slightly concrete sense to it. And it's important to think of the timeline here. 105 AD to Muhammad's day, 500 years. If you live in one place for 500 years, that starts to give you an identity. And we see this in all the other provinces of the Roman Empire. Syrians, Phoenicians, it generates Anatolians a sense of identity. The second point is that Nabatean Aramaic, now that it is no longer backed up by the authority of Nabatean kings, began to lose its status as the dominant written language in the southern part of the former Nabatean kingdom, so the Hijaz and modern South Jordan, and gradually ceded its place to Arabic. So the rise of Arabic is another big story through the first half of the first millennium AD. Ahmed touched on this in his lecture last week. Arabic had already been a spoken language of the Nabatean kingdom, as we can see from the presence of Arabic loanwords in Nabatean Aramaic texts from the southern territories. But now it became a written language too. Initially, it was inscribed in a variety of scripts. Most popular in Northwest Arabia for this purpose was the Nabatean Aramaic script. And our earliest example is again a text. Ahmad and I are slightly in parallel here, so he branches off onto very hardcore orthography, which I can't do. So this lovely inscription from al-Hijaz from 267 AD, Ahmad showed rather nicely that the basic language is Arabic, but then in key formalized points like the date and so on, the person uses Aramaic. Most popular, so this Aramaic script, then writing of Arabic and Aramaic script drove the development of this script. Here it's very Nabatean Aramaic-y looking to me, but it gradually evolves over the period 270 to 470 until by the late 5th century onwards, we begin to see Arabic inscriptions in what we would recognize as Arabic script. And just to give you an idea of where we're talking about, we go up to this little cluster around the Namara, al-Jamal area, in very north of modern Jordan, south of Syria, out to Jandal, and then again this kind of line of text from Madain Saleh through Tabuk around Petra and that southern part of Palestine. I've marked on the Safavitic text and Hismaic texts, which Ahmad works on. People used to work with a relatively narrow definition of Arabic, so they only had about 7 or 8 pre-Islamic Arabic texts. Ahmad has very cleverly shown that Safavitic and Hismaic, if we just think more of broader dialects, then these could get incorporated, and giving himself an extra 30, 40, 50,000 texts to work on. Well, you could say he's either very clever or a masochist, depends how you look at it. There's also a number of texts that are undated, plausibly hailing from the 6th century. For example, at al-Jamal in northern Jordan, and a little cluster between Madain Saleh and Tabuk. Then in 568 to 69, we get this wonderful inscription from the lintel of a church in the village of Harran, south of Damascus, the first use of Arabic in a bilingual text in a monumental setting, just a couple of years before Muhammad's birth. People generally use this just for the language. Okay, great, it's some Arabic, but if you just, in terms of the social historical context, this is an amazing text. In the Roman Empire, there would have been hundreds of languages spoken, but almost none get to make it to monumental inscriptions. In the East, we only have Greek and Syriac, that's it. So the arrival of Arabic here on a monumental text, on a, not just actually on a par with Greek really, because the Arabic is slightly dominant, it goes over onto the side of the Greek, so the Greek is slightly subservient. Behind this is a backstory about the rise of provincial Arabophone elites that's kind of been building for a while, and now in this later 6th century they feel confident to put up their own text. And it's not, you know, you wouldn't be able to just do this if you're a nobody. So this means this is an accepted member of the Roman elite. And just give you the reading of it for those who can't see it so well. So in the area of the Roman province of Arabia, we have texts in which people self-define as Arab, and texts in a language that is patently close to the Quran. Surely then this is the language that the Quran intends when it refers to itself as an Arabi Quran, composed in the Arabic tongue. Peter Webb worries that accepting this would imply that the Arabic language is the exclusive property of an Arab ethnos. But I think this concern is misplaced. There is no reason why those who called themselves Arab before Islam should not have spoken other languages, nor why the Arabi language should not have been spoken by those who did not self-define as Arab. And there is no getting away from the fact that these late 5th and 6th century Arabic inscriptions discovered so far, though very short, are in the same language as the Quran, though possibly of a different dialect or register. These Arabic inscriptions also have another connection with the Quran, namely that they all appear to be written by monotheists, specifically Christians, which is made explicit by something like the drawing of a cross, the presence on a Christian building, or their attachment to a Christian Arab patron. The relevance of this is that it helps to explain the very developed monotheist vocabulary and ideas of the Quran, namely that it had emerged in a region that had, for more than a century, been exposed to Christianity, and very likely to Judaism too, though we have no epigraphic evidence of this, not past the 4th century AD anyway. What is A'jami? If we have some sense of what is Arabi, it's much less clear what the Quran means by A'jami. Moreover, like Arabi, its meaning changed in the aftermath of the Muslim conquest. As Arab identity became stronger and the Arab sense of superiority over those whom they had defeated and now ruled became reinforced, A'jami and the collective noun Ajam came to serve as the polar opposite of Arabness, with all the negative things that implied. Furthermore, as the doctrine was elaborated that the language of the Quran, Arabi, was inimitable and miraculous, and proficiency in it a mark of eloquence and sophistication, A'jami became an increasingly pejorative term, used in the same way as barbaros among the ancient Greeks to refer to all things foreign and outlandish. This is the meaning of A'jami that the first Muslim exegetes knew, and so when they tried to identify the person mentioned in verse 16:103, who allegedly taught Muhammad and spoke A'jami, they always thought of someone lowly, a slave or a hired servant, and either non-Arab or non-Muslim or both. The most popular options are Jabr, a Christian slave from Ayman Tamr in southern Iraq, Adas, a Christian slave from Nineveh in northern Iraq, or the Jewish servant Yasar Abu Fuqayha. So we again need to try to get back to what the term A'jami might have meant in Muhammad's day. Unlike Arabi, however, we have no source outside of the Quran to help us understand its import. The two most recent Western attempts to consider its significance have reached similar solutions, though driven by different theories on Arab identity. Jan Retzo argues that, quote, there is no doubt that the word A'jamun refers to those who do not have a good command of the Arabiya and might not even understand it. The reason for this, in his view, is that the Arabs were, quote, a religious cultic institution rather than an ethnic group, and their Arabic speech was regarded as a sacred medium, which had a structure that deviated from the everyday vernacular tongue, the A'jami. Yet this seems to go against verse 42:7, which says that the reason God revealed to Muhammad in Arabic lectionary was so that he might warn the mother of towns and those around it, implying that Arabic was simply the local language, and that it was chosen for Muhammad because it was, in the words of 1444, the language of his people, and according to many verses, could be easily understood. Retzo is right that the context of the word's use is religious, but given that we're talking about its occurrence in a divine revelation, that is hardly surprising. The second attempt to investigate the sense of A'jami comes from Peter Webb, who is also motivated by a desire to avoid any hint that the term Arab might have had an ethnic sense before Muhammad, in part inspired by Fred Donner's idea that Islam could not have owed anything to Arab national sentiment, and in part wishing to bolster his own theory that Arab identity was only forged after the establishment of an Islamic state. He therefore postulates that the term Arabi is simply an adjective meaning clear or pure, and that A'jami is its antonym, indicating, quote, something nonsensical or a sullied message. Yet such a sense gives an odd spin to verses like 26:198 and 41:44. Would anyone really have petitioned God to reveal a nonsensical Quran or a sullied message in an unclear language? Webb then moves closer to Retzo's position, concluding that, quote, Arabi connotes a transcendently clear koine from God, not a terrestrial vernacular, presumably concurring with Retzo, that, though he does not explicitly say so, that the word for the terrestrial vernacular is A'jami. So from Webb, Retzo, we get this idea of sacred speech, Arabi contrasting with vernacular speech, A'jami. The problem with the interpretation of both Retzo and Webb is that they're buying into the Quran's own polemical vision. Muhammad is trying to defend the use for divine revelation of Arabi over A'jami, and so talks up the former and denigrates the latter. But the very fact that he feels the need to do so indicates that he's aware that many in his audience did not agree, and indeed would seem to have thought that divine messages should be conveyed in the A'jami language. This is clear in verse 41:44. start of which, if we had made it an A'jami lectionary, is clearly replying to a question from some of Muhammad's detractors as to why his revelation was not in A'jami, as was presumably considered to be the norm. The continuation of the verse is interesting. Then they would have said, if it's only its verses had been made clear, had been fusilat, A'jami and Arabī. The preferred reading has a hamza between fusilat and A'jami, which is taken to be an interrogative particle. And the whole was then understood to mean, if only its verses had been made clear by being rendered in our language, Arabī, is it appropriate that an A'jami text be conveyed by an Arabī prophet? Most Muslim exegetes interpret it thus because in their day the pair Arabi-A'jami were diametrically opposed in terms of both ethnicity, Arab, non-Arab, and speech, eloquent, inarticulate. And Muhammad had come to be regarded as the best of the Arabs and the most eloquent of them. And so he could not be associated with A'jami, linked to non-Arab origins and poor Arabic expression. However, although this was the dominant interpretation of the verse, a few exegetes read it with omission of the interrogative particle, then understanding it to mean if only its verses had been made clear in A'jami and Arabī, so that both A'jami speakers and Arabī speakers could understand them. In both cases, fusilat is glossed with buyilat, made clear. But though this is sufficient to explain the use of this verb in most attestations in the Quran, generally it's used quite vaguely, just to say fasalna al-ayat, without any accompanying context. But occasionally we see that it's not quite precise enough. For example, there is verse 41:3, a book whose verses have been fusilat into or as an Arabic lectionary, kitabun fusilat ayatuhu Qur'anan Arabiyyan, where some element of conveyance or translation seems implied. This comes across more strongly in verse 10:37. Which informs us that the Quran is a confirmation, a tasdeeq of what is before it, and a tafsil of the earlier scripture. If we take this together with 46:12, just a minute, I'm giving you the right bit. Sorry, I'm not keeping up. Sorry. So comparing here 10:37, and then I've given you directly below it 46:12. This lectionary is a book that confirms the book of Moses. The book of Moses had just occurred earlier in the verse, in the Arabic language. Then we see that tafsil must have a sense of translation, or rather explanatory translation, something that elucidates as well as translates. It's the equivalent of French interpréter, which also has both senses of explaining and translating. What Muhammad's interlocutors would seem to have wanted then was an explanatory translation or gloss in Arabic of a revealed A'jami text. Effectively, they were seeking something like the Jewish Targum, the paraphrastic and interpretative text that helped Aramaic-speaking Jews read the Hebrew Bible. If this is correct, it suggests that for the Quran, Arabi and A'jami are two distinct linguistic entities that were sufficiently unlike each other that they required translation from one to the other, whether they were two separate languages or two mutually intelligible forms of the same language. Of course, the terms are also likely to have conveyed value judgments in the same way that Deutsch, German, is deutlich, clear, and the speech of Barbaroi, foreigners, is barbaros, outlandish and uncultured. But they're also being employed to refer to discrete linguistic units. And this is also implied by verse 16:103 about Muhammad having a human teacher. Although this is a polemical statement, the original accusation must have been rooted in the fact that Muhammad was discussing Jewish and Christian scriptures with someone. This means that the alleged teacher knew one of the languages in which Jewish and Christian religious texts were written in the Hijaz. Greek is a possibility, given that this was the official language of the Roman Byzantine Empire, but we have no evidence for it in northwest Arabia after the 3rd century AD. By contrast, this region had a very long history of contact with Aramaic, going all the way back, in fact, to around 500 BC, so it's imperial, Nabatean, and Jewish. And so it was a very likely candidate for A'jami. And I think I'll wind up now. I was going to give you, sorry, I give you that back again, didn't I? Yeah. I'll give you a little bit here on how documents show, the earliest Arabic documents use some formulae that are already in Aramaic text. The way you start off with a demonstrative, as in PERF 558, 22 Hijra, Hadama Akhava. Interestingly, the Greek isn't. The Greek presents it in a subjective way. I, Abdullah, tell you to give me this. The use of bara'a, the root bara'a in quittances is the same. Interesting, this rather nice example of shahida ala nafsihi in Aramaic, al-nafsha sahad, to say a person was present and accepted that the document was binding on them. We have a couple of examples of that, one from Dura Europos. And then, as Ahmed actually pointed out, things like the use of Aramaic bar and wawation, Arabic texts of the 6th and 7th centuries. One would like to have more examples from the intervening centuries before positing a link between the Aramaic legal tradition and the early Islamic one. But the aforementioned similarities and vocabulary are suggested. Moreover, we do have evidence of the closeness of the Nabatean Aramaic and Arabic writing traditions in other spheres, such as orthography. So we have the work of Benedium, Ahmed al-Jalad, Merain ben Qutran, and others, and fossilized Aramaic features in early Arabic texts. I'll leave with one that Ahmed started to give you, which he shows the bar and the wawation on the case. But there's also actually the end, this rather interesting bit, katab yadi, which is actually the way, going back to the 1st century BC, on document papyri, you'd actually just simply say, I signed this. This is your way of saying my signature. This provides more evidence of a long period of interaction between the two language traditions in Northwest Arabia, a conclusion that has been emphasized by a number of recent studies on the language of the Quran. This is an exciting and fast-changing field. More and more inscriptions are being discovered. As with Ahmed was really out there in Jordan in his lecture, that we know he's actively looking for more text. And so this is likely to change with time, but I would like to tentatively conclude that the term A'jami in the Quran should be understood as referring to some form of the Aramaic language. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Robert. Terrific. One of the problems with Zoom is you can't hear our applause, but in virtual ways, people are very grateful for that talk. You see some messages coming through the chat now, and
do I have to stop share? Is that...
Yeah, that would be great if you could do that. Yeah. Then just so
sorry, as you can tell, I'm a novice.
No problem. Thank you so much. So terrific. We can move to a discussion now, and there were some comments that came through during the talk. I don't know if Merain, if you wanted to start us off. Did you want to add any thoughts on some of your comments there, Merain? Okay, I see. He just said no, nothing in particular. Okay, I'm going to start us off then. I'm going to usurp my privilege as host to also ask a question. I just wanted, I guess, then to combine, maybe you said this and I wasn't attentive enough, but your insights about fusila as an interpretive gloss, or the comparison of that to the Targum, and then in particular verse 41, 44, where the opponents say if it had been fusilat Arabi and A'jami. So how does your insight on A'jami help us understand that verse better? Maybe it's just a way of restating some of the points you made, but could you just zero in on that verse a bit?
Yeah, I mean, this is where I said about forced marriage, of course, marrying up Quranic terms with a reality behind it. So there certainly were Jewish communities in the Hijaz, and we actually have a few texts where it's made clear that Aramaic is their key language. There's one nice rabbinic text where someone goes to Hegra, Madain Saleh, to check on the meaning of a word, because he knows that they have a slightly conservative form of the Aramaic language. So he wants to go and chat with them about that. And that's like late 3rd century. So Jewish Aramaic is likely to be important. As I said, Imperial Aramaic, already around 500 BC, we get texts written, Nabatean Aramaic. So it's a different forms of Aramaic, but really it's got a 1100-year history by the time of Muhammad. So I'd have thought the most important would have been the Jewish Aramaic in this context of reading scriptures, where for them they have a higher language scripture, but they use their spoken language to understand it. So in this verse, is there a request we should be keeping the A'jami language for scripture, same way, say like Latin in medieval Europe, but given that many of us don't properly understand it anymore, can we have an explanation in Arabic that we all speak in this area? So that's what I'm wondering as the background. There's obviously something that Muhammad's replying to. So what I'm trying to get to is, what is it that they're asking? He's obviously wanting to play it down, what they're asking, but there's some reality behind what he's asking. That's what I'm wondering, whether Jews specifically asking, or just because this is a standard, way of thinking about scripture.
I find the argument compelling, especially its usefulness for verse 12 of Surah 46, where it speaks of Kitab Musaddiq Lisan Arabi. The insistence that this is affirming the book of Moses, but is in a different tongue or language. We have a question from Muhammad Ragab, please.
Well, first of all, thank you for the lecture. My question goes on the verse 198 of the Surah 26. وَلَنَزَّلْنَاهُ عَلَى بَعْضِ الْأَعْجَمِيِّينَ. If we revealed it to some of the A'jamis. You have chosen to translate it as if we revealed it to these A'jami people in the A'jami language. Well, my first impression of the verse was it's an Arabic language, and that's why they wouldn't believe in it. So I would like to have your input on this, why you have chosen to translate it that it would be revealed to the A'jami people in A'jami language and not in Arabic language.
Oh, I see. You're saying that you're taking it that they wouldn't understand it, therefore. That seems a bit simplistic, doesn't it? If I speak to you in French and you don't know French, you won't understand it. But I take it that there's some quality that they don't like, rather than that it's simply they purely just couldn't understand it. But I take your point. You could actually go either way with that. But I take it that there's a quality. It's not about the fact of do you understand it or not. Is it simply a case that we wouldn't understand it? But at A'jami, there's something wrong with it, for the understanding. It's not their language, and so they don't speak it. But I agree, you could take this in a different way. I've got a lot of, in the art, well, I'm going to write this up as an article, and there's a lot of Quran commentaries that I'm ransacking. It's interesting that they don't really, they seem to take it for granted what it means. They don't try and explain, oh, by the way, A'jami means this. Occasionally you get something like, especially in the identity of the teacher of Muhammad, then some of them say Rumi. Though even then, you don't know whether they mean the Rumi in the sense of Melkite, if you know, rather than anything to do with Greek. But yes, I'll kind of bring that out more. But I think I take it, as I say, it's more to do with the quality that goes with the different language, rather than whether people can understand it or not.
Thank you, Robert. Kendra.
Hi, thank you so much for your lecture. I was wondering, Dan Gibson has this book, The Quranic Geography, in the section on the Mecca question, and analyzing the geographical cues in the Quran, and maybe thinking that the holy city was originally Petra and it got later sort of redacted or changed. Would that impact or affect your opinions in any way on what language milieu was available or what documentation has been discovered?
In many ways, it wouldn't actually, because of course, being the capital of the Nabatean Empire, even more strongly, the Nabatean Aramaic would come across. So in some sense, it would help my argument, but I can't say that I exactly endorse it. There are, I mean, it is a messy area, the kind of early Qiblas. Always these theories where something was very different, you do wonder, wouldn't someone have noticed? So I always have a bit of a problem with that, whether people would, though I do wonder whether there could have been many religious centers, and it's not so much that there wasn't a Mecca, but Mecca was one of a number of important places. But anyway, no, it wouldn't really affect the argument. And Petra, we know Arabic was used there and Aramaic, and with the same thing, that gradually the Aramaic drops out and the Arabic picks up more, but also Greek does, because it's a city, and we're blessed by a discovery of papyri there from the 6th century, which show us that Greek is still the functioning language. And so then I would have to give more consideration to whether Greek will be meant by A'jami.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Robert. Mortaza, please. And I saw your question, Farhad, but let's start with Mortaza.
Thanks, Professor Robert Hoyland. Just wondering, do you see any connection between, because you know that Quran invites its audience to bring a similar book like Quran as a challenge, you know, to say that if you say that Quran is not true, can you bring a similar book? Do you see any connection between this kind of inviting to a kind of challenge and your discussion on what might Arabi and A'jami mean in the Quran? Because as you know, the audience of the Quran knew Arabic, and some of them have been even great poets before Islam. So what kind of challenge it might be that Quran is inviting to that can you bring a similar book? So what kind of similarity does it mean here? You know what I mean? So I thought that it might have some kind of potential connections with your, you know, just as a clue or as something I've just thought about.
That's a rather nice question, actually. It's interesting, isn't it? There's obviously discussions in Muhammad's time about what makes a legitimate revelation. Would we recognize a real revelation or not? And this is obviously what Muhammad's having to defend against. That verse has been taken in a particular way, of course, to say that the language is so special and no one else will be able to replicate the language, that high type of language. But one could take it in a different way, as I'm discussing in this paper, really about the validity of the language, what language of revelation, what the actual nature of the language itself, is that important. So Muhammad, I like to think, is kind of innovating in the same way as the author of that inscription in southern Syria in 568, you know, he's innovating really by putting up this rather fantastic inscription in Arabic and Greek. So Arabic, if you like, is getting its moment at this time, and it's starting to be used for other purposes besides just speech and inscriptions, and it's presumably being used for documents and so on. And so there's a debate on about whether it can be used for revelation. But I find it difficult without context to be sure how Muhammad meant that point about bring one like it, how that challenge is meant. So I'm going to leave it there, because it's a wonderful question, and I promise I'll think about it as I go to sleep tonight.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert. Farhad asks, maybe you can see it there in the chat box, can you explain a little bit more why A'jami is Aramaic and not Hebrew, while the Jewish scriptures were in Hebrew?
Yeah, I mean, I play with a number of options here. As I say, Greek needn't be excluded, because Greek is obviously so dominant, and we have huge amounts of evidence for it, at least right up into the very borders of modern Saudi Arabia. Hebrew is presumably possible. It's a pure evidence thing. We actually do have Hebrew inscriptions up until the 3rd century, but then we don't have any evidence. It's for a relatively short window that we get the Hebrew text, something like the 1st and the 3rd centuries AD, whereas Aramaic we get from around 500 BC to 469, 459 is the last one. So it's one hell of a long period, and there's a hell of a lot of text. So that's all just pure weight of evidence. If I'm more speculating, you're right, and just don't worry about our surviving evidence, and that's not as facetious as it sounds, because relatively we don't have much evidence, then Hebrew is presumably a possibility, just because of the antiquity and authority that it must have enjoyed in that area. If we can read from the Quran that the Jewish communities are substantial.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up about your observation regarding the early Arabic inscriptions in Arabic script. I think you said that these inscriptions, which are just a handful of them, are all by monotheists, maybe all by Christians. Is that right? Did I get you right?
Yeah, the actual Arabic inscriptions in Arabic script.
Yes.
Not the ones in other scripts.
Right. Yeah. So I wanted to follow up precisely about the script then, and to ask then, what is the relationship between Christian missions, maybe, or evangelizing and the appearance of the Arabic script, or is that a red herring and something else is going on?
Yeah, I mean, I take it that there's two plausible likely influences for the writing of Arabic. One is the rise of these Arab philarchs employed by the empires in senior positions to both to monitor tribes around them, but also to fight alongside the empire. They're getting subsidies, they're getting titles, they have influence, they have power. And we see this, what they do with that power is to start sponsoring building. We see a number of 6th century Arab rulers, particularly of Hassan, putting their names on inscriptions, or there are inscriptions in manuscripts which say this was done in the time of the philarchate of this person. So they're quite influential. So they could have sponsored poetry, writing. We know the Jebel Sayf inscription is interesting because it says al-Harra sent-ni, Arsalani, with a mission, if you like. So he's presumably received a letter or something telling him to go there and do something. So that's, possible documents in particular being pushed by these kind of little Arab kingdoms. The other is the spread of Christianity, and this I take as an obvious parallel the fact that all major kind of peoples who convert to Christianity, they all start to get their own script. Georgians, Armenians, Palestinian Aramaic start to be, lots of Christian texts start being written in the 4th century, Coptic and so on. It just seems to be, you get to write it, text in your own language to teach it so that it can be taught. And we have examples from various missionaries and Arab and holy men in the deserts, teaching in the local languages. So this, and that's an interesting background, of course, to the Quranic statement about every messenger is sent with their own language. That there is this idea for Abrahamic monotheism that it should be available in your language. Christianity, Islam, anyway, Judaism is a bit different.
Right. Okay, terrific. May has a question, please.
Thank you, Robert, for this wonderful lecture. I've just got, something came to mind that I thought may be related to some of the ideas you floated here. There's that famous Quranic verse which says that مِنْهُمْ أُمِّيُّونَ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ الْكِتَابَ. And there are some Gentiles among them who did not know the book, are not familiar with the book. Now I thought maybe this is, the ideas of ethnicity and language that we see reflected in this verse should be sort of connected with the ideas that you just floated about language and ethnicity in the Quran, in the Quranic milieu.
Sorry, I didn't catch the Arabic, the verse you were talking about.
And there are Gentiles among them who, it's in Baqarah, if I'm not mistaken, 78. And there are Gentiles among them who do not know the book.
So you asked about the link between language and ethnicity there.
This is not irrelevant because it's supposed, it ties in ethnicity, Gentileness, that there are some Gentiles among the opponents, presumably either the Mushrikun or Jews, I don't remember, or both, if I'm not wrong. And there are a group of Gentiles among them who are not supposed to be familiar either because of linguistic boundaries or something else, are not familiar with the book, presumably the Torah or whatever, Moses' book or whatever. And the Quran is chastising these Gentiles for not knowing the book and making claims based on hearsay, because it goes on to say that what they say is just hearsay.
Yeah. Another very good question, which I'll have to sleep on tonight, I think. But I mean, the tricky thing in all this, and this is always the problem when you relate the Quran to the real, if you like, reality behind, is we don't have much information about it. In fact, we have hardly any information about the reality behind. So Ummi is a loaded term in itself. What exactly, you say Gentiles, but obviously it's been used in different contexts. Do they actually...
I've got an accent.
Yeah, I mean, are they illiterate and don't know writing, or are they Gentile and don't know scripture?
May you've published on this
positions
question, right?
Yeah,
Sorry,
yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a really fascinating point, actually. And how widespread is knowledge? I mean, always, because when I'm writing about it, I was just thinking today, I should probably put a footnote when I say something like interpretative translation, that I'm talking about a perspective that the Quran giving as to how it views itself. But I don't mean, obviously, literally it's a translation, because there's almost nothing translated. But and the same, what's the perspective of the Quran on what it's seeing around? And this is also the problem when you think about Arabi. Because we link it with Arabic, then we think it's a very clear cut. The language is very messy, because I mean, Europe, because we have little nation states, we like the idea of having each nation state having its own language, even when they're almost the same. So Flemish and Dutch, sorry for any Flemish and Dutch people out there, but they're very, 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 very similar languages. And yet we give them different names. And in Arabic, which comes in a huge amount of varieties of dialects, we give it one name, even though often people can't understand each other, like Morocco and Iraq or something. So I'm not certain whether it's speaking scripturally, and it's about people, whether they don't know their scripture, or whether it is more about illiteracy and writing. The short answer, May, is I'll give more thought to that. It's a very good question. And again, it's another question where we think about what might be the reality that lies behind the Quran.
Thank you.
Sorry, not a very good answer, but I promise I'll think about it.
Thank you for all the great questions. We have a couple of minutes left. I saw that Ahmed had an observation there. Just scrolling up here on Quran and Arabian غير ذي عوج لعلهم يتقون. So, and I don't know, Ahmed, if you're still with us, if you wanted to comment on that verse and how it might be relevant to the missionary point. Ahmed might have. Are you still with us, Ahmed? Okay. So yes.
Sorry, my internet is cutting out for some reason. Yes, thank you, Robert. No, I was just on your point of the talking about missionaries and their activities in the Arabian Peninsula in the 6th century and the role of the Arabic script. One can imagine that while it may not have been, and we don't have any evidence either way yet, but a proper translation of the Quran, of the Bible into Arabic, there certainly would have been maybe oral translations or translations of smaller sections, and these might not have been in a very good kind of Arabic. They were done by missionaries who were not native speakers. They could have been in a how do you say it, a crooked Arabic. And this verse that the Quran, you can see the difference between the Quran and these other texts, these other renditions of scripture in Arabic, because the Quran is obviously done by a native speaker in an aesthetic register. And it would, if you compare something like the Quran to early translations of the glosses of the Bible in Arabic, Melkite glosses, for example, you can see that for an Arabic speaker, those glosses seem rather awkward because they follow so closely the original language, whereas the Quran takes its liberty and is in fact an Arabic text from the beginning. And so perhaps that connects to this idea of there not being any crookedness in its language.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very nice point. I mean, and also thinking of your work, Ahmad, it's kind of interesting really to speculate, but we're wondering exactly the degrees of how the different Arabic dialect groups are thinking of each other, whether they consider it a part of their own language or not, because it's not just related to linguistic realities. We have a couple of very nice inscriptions, one from the west of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, and then from a later and different period all the way over in Bactria, where they both start off by saying, I'm putting this in the Arya language, you know, the language of the Aryans. I mean, to us, they're not the same, Bactrian and ancient Old Persian, but they obviously did consider it the same. But you can obviously get the converse, that, you know, you might consider that these people's language over there, although it might seem similar to a linguist, is actually, as you say, you know, it's a bit distorted, a bit deviant. So yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you so much. And among other things, you generated some comments about Dutch and Flemish there in the chat box. Wonderful. Well, friends, we're at the hour, and so what remains is to thank Robert for a great talk. Thanks also to all of you for attending. So many of you have been faithful attendees throughout our seminar. So thank you for coming back each week. Please don't hesitate to spread the word that all of these talks will be at the International Quranic Studies Association YouTube channel. Also spread the word about IQSA generally. And I feel like we've become friends over the last 7 weeks. Hopefully we will have a round 2 coming up soon, so I will disseminate news about that. And again, thank you so much, Robert.
Great, thanks, Gabriel. Thanks to all of you as well, especially the questions. I promise to think about them. Thank you. And bye for now.